Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unofficial Seminar. I'm Arup K, Chatterjee, and I'm joined by a very, very special guest indeed today, Professor Saugata Bhaduri, of whose I've had the privilege of being his student. And Professor Saugata Bhaduri is currently in Germany, where he's a visiting professor. Professor Saugata Bhaduri has had a very long and illustrious career as professor of English at the Center for English Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's also extremely passionate about literary theory, theatre, and especially the subject of today's conversation, and that is the history and particularly the cultural history of Bengal. Professor Saugata Bhaduri is also the author of a very well-received and widely reviewed book, Polycoloniality, which was published by Bloomsbury, if I'm not wrong, in the year 2020. And I also happened to review that book back then in the Hindu. So, Professor, my sincere thanks to you for joining me on the Unofficial Seminar. How have you been?
I'm absolutely fine, and thank you so much for having me over.
How's Germany, sir?
It's fine.
I wanted to begin by probing about your own recognition of your understanding of Bengal's history and its especially its ethnic and colonial and racial diversity. So I'm both asking, how far do you think the boundaries of your subject, your discipline, allow you to have a grasp over it? And how far do you think Bengal enjoys a rich ethnic and colonial and racial diversity?
Well, as far as one part of your question is concerned, which is how far does my discipline allow me to engage with such questions, one must be very thankful to the fact that English studies nowadays really doesn't mean anything, and therefore you can do everything. And therefore there is no issue whatsoever as far as my discipline is concerned to dabble in this or that. So that question should kind of address itself, by the by. But to return to the sum and substance of your question, Bengal has had a very long history, and it's not even one of those crypto histories or one of those newly being rewritten revisionist histories where you try to mythologically draw roots, because what generally we identify as Bengal, which is the deltaic region of Ganga, I mean, that is exactly what geographically Bengal is, with a bit of an extension here and there up to the Himalayas perhaps, and in the east perhaps up to the lower hills of northeastern India. But nevertheless, if Gangetic Delta is primarily what Bengal is, then we find references to that area from very ancient sources, because both Plutarch and Pliny talk about Gangaridai, as it's called, which is the Gangetic Deltaic region, and Ptolemy actually gives a map also exactly of what he identifies as Gangaridai, and that is fully what we today foresee as Bengal. And all the ancient sources talk about not only the richness of this particular terrain, but also their military plight, including suggestions, and which have led to other historians have very different opinions about whether Gangaridai is indeed, is it a G or it was Gandaridai or something, northwestern India, the Gandhara region, because Alexander may or may not have come this far. Even Megasthenes, and I'll just go back to it because I'm just jumping the gun a bit. Megasthenes in India also talks about visiting a particular emperor called Chandraketugarh, who has generally been identified with Chandragupta because phonetically it seems quite similar to Chandragupta. But there have been historians who have identified Chandraketugarh, and which is phonetically closer, therefore, to Chandraketu, and which leads me to what I did jump over. So archaeological excavations over the past close to a century now, because from the 1920s, 30s, excavations began in earnest, have discovered significant ruins dating from up to the 5th or 6th century BC of proper civilizational remnants, including houses, and of course numerous archaeological artifacts, both in Western Bengal and Eastern Bengal, more specifically in Chandraketugarh, which is the connection to the Chandraketu that I was talking about, which is just about 40 kilometers from Calcutta, and in Wari-Bateshwar, which is in today's Bangladesh, and which have generally, and this is an accepted historical fact, which has been generally identified with Gangaridai. So the kingdom of Gangaridai, which apparently scared Alexander so much that he did not want to go anywhere beyond the western parts of India, has been historically identified and from very ancient sources with Bengal. So Bengal has had a very long historical recognition of it being, let's say, a force to reckon with. And indeed, excavations have found all kinds of artifacts dating, as I said, right up to the 6th to 7th century BC and continuously therefrom, including port regions. We all know about Tumluk, today's Tumluk, which is Tamraliptum, numerous excavations. So it is got a long history and a continuous presence, so to say, in international imagination. And then throughout the Buddhist era, we have so many Buddhist ruins all over, like Paharpur and Mahasthangarh, all in Eastern Bengal, primarily though. So we've had a continuous history, historical presencing, so to say, so much so that by the late medieval age, Bengal was a sought after entity in the European imagination. And we do know our Marco Polo's and his mention of Bengal, his apparent visit to Bengal also in the 1290s, that is. And then, well, the rest is history. The rest is well-known history. But that being said, while Bengal per se, or the Gangetic Delta, the deltaic region per se, in spite of having been imprinted very strongly in the European and global imaginary for the last 2,500 years or so, the ethnic composition, so the land of Bengal may have been a distinct entity, so to say. But the people of Bengal, because we are not concerned only with the land that makes Bengal what it is, but also the people, therein, once again, genetic findings would have suggested that we are indeed a curious admixture of different races, probably a bit more so than our northwestern subcontinental counterparts, and where, while we do have ancient North Indian genes in us, and which is a significant part, but a significant presence of East Asian genes and Australasiatic genes makes perhaps the population of Bengal much more heterogeneous and much more mixed than we would think of a particular rather homogeneous group as. So I would therefore build up a binary to cut the otherwise even potentially longer response short. So we can perhaps bifurcate Bengal into two parts. One, the terrain of Bengal, the other, the people of Bengal. And the terrain of Bengal, having had a fairly homogeneous, sought after, often valorized reference in history for the last 2,500 years, versus the people of Bengal, who, however, not only do not show that homogeneity, but further have, because of their heterogeneity perhaps, because of their rather mongrel nature perhaps, have been often ostracized or thought to be on the margins of what would be a civilizational continuum. So thereby one could perhaps bring to close my rather roundabout response to your very pointed question.
No, this is more than impressive, Professor. But I have a few, doubts that wherein I believe I represent a lot of desire among Bengalis and also Indians in general and scholars worldwide as to what did Bengal think of itself, and when did Bengal start thinking about itself at all. Now, you surely were pointing at the fact, you didn't mention it, but correct me if I'm wrong, Dhaka has been far more significant, a commercial capital harbor than Calcutta. Calcutta can be accused of being invented in a pejorative sense of the word, only 300 or 400 years ago, but Dhaka has been far, far longer. You mentioned the Pal dynasty, or you mentioned the Buddhist regime of the 7th, 8th till the 12th century AD. So my first part of the question is, since when did Bengal start thinking of itself as Bengal, or Bengalis as Bengalis? And, I just wanted to add to your point, Professor, recently I discovered, and you may know about this person already, a Siamese cook from the 17th century in, of course, Buddhist Siam, Thailand, in the kingdom of Ayutthaya. And she was also Portuguese, Catholic, and she was also Bengali. So she was born of a Goan Portuguese Catholic father who was partly also Bengali, and a Japanese Bengali mother, if you understand that combination. So with 4 or 5 kinds of hybridity, she reached Siam, and she and her family were executed. I mean, she was spared alive eventually, and she became a famous cook. Long story short, her Siamese cooking, or her Portuguese Franco-Portuguese styles of cooking, had tremendous Bengali influence as far back as 17th century. So, that's far back enough. Anyway, that's more of a remark than a question. So when did Bengal start thinking of itself as an entity?
Right. So first, a couple of clarifications as far as your Siamese cook is concerned. That's not real. I wouldn't think of it as very rare at all, since you're talking about the 16th century, because the possible admixture of Portuguese and Bengalis and people from the West Coast and people from northeastern India leading right through Burma into Thailand, that would not be very odd at all in the 16th century, given that Bengal was very much a trading center for the Portuguese, and who, with the Arakanis, who were precisely the coastal region of Burma, which would have a fair connection with Siam also, therefore. So I do not find it very surprising that there would indeed be a cook who would have mixed Portuguese and East Asian descent, and yet think of herself as a Bengali, himself perhaps, as a Bengali, while cooking in the kingdom of Siam. So that's one remark. The second remark, and after that I'd indeed go back to your question. The second remark about the greater centrality of Eastern Bengal over Western Bengal, that may not be factually all that true, because both the Palas and the Senas that you mentioned, they ruled from what would technically now be in West Bengal, because Gaur, the capital Gaur, is indeed in Malda, and of course the Ratcliffe line is a curious line. Malda could have been Eastern Bengal. So let's not take Eastern Bengal, Western Bengal, or the dichotomy very seriously here. But historically, the Palas and Senas primarily ruled from Western Bengal, what would be today's Malda district, which is clearly in West Bengal. And after, however, the last of the Senas would have fled to the Bikrampur area and starts a parallel empire, while the western part of Bengal, that is Gaur, gets conquered by Bakhtiyar Khilji's troops. That's another issue. So the ascendancy of East. Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt, Professor, but in fact, again, correct me if I'm wrong. But that is when a major migration of Bengalis happens from Bengal towards present-day Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, and there's actually a clan of Gaurs living in and around Haryana and Rajasthan.
Yeah, certainly. And there are, of course, if we take the term Gaur very seriously, then there are the Gaur Saraswat Brahmins of Goa also, since we mentioned Goa earlier. But then let's drop it there. Let me get back to what I was indeed talking about. So in the colonial era, so which starts from the 15th century onwards, late 15th, but for Bengal, very early 16th century, 1505 or so, we find parallel ascendancy of Western Bengal ports and Eastern Bengal ports. So while the Portuguese make Chattogram their grand port, Porto Grande, they, however, make Hooghly also, Shadgaon to be precise, their small port, Porto Pequeno. So it's not that East Bengal necessarily had an ascendancy over either the Palasena periods or immediately after that during the colonial era, beginning from the early 16th century either. Of course, that there could have been two nations and there continue to be two nations, and as to what would have been ascendant over the other, these things vary over time, but there has been no historical constant of Dhaka being necessarily more important than parts of Western Bengal. Calcutta perhaps, because Dhaka was the Mughal capital, though the Mughals and the British are the kind of contemporary, the Mughals and the Portuguese certainly are. The Portuguese came before the Mughals, as we do know. The Mughals are later entrants into our subcontinent continent than the Portuguese, Babur having coming in 1526. But nevertheless, without chronologically mixing things up, so Calcutta, yes, because Calcutta or the surroundings of Calcutta became of any consequence only with the Portuguese and the Dutch around the early 17th century, and Calcutta itself gets founded only in the late 17th century. Dhaka by then had already been the Mughal capital, and also yes, so maybe by the 17th century, by the late 16th century, early 17th century, perhaps because of the Mughal expansion into Bengal, Dhaka becomes a little more important, but again short-livedly, because again Murshidabad becomes the Mughal capital from Dhaka by the early 18th century, let's put it at that. But anyway, these two caveats aside, let me return to your original question, which is from when do Bengalis think of themselves as Bengalis? So the term Bongo, or even derivative words like Bengal, etc., would have existed in textual sources from quite some time. And even to recognize a literary or linguistic style as Gauriya, that exists in our Sanskrit poetic treatises from at least the 7th century AD or so. But whether, therefore, Bengal and Bengali linguistic literary styles were indeed constructs of an external vision, or whether Bengalis themselves thought of themselves as Bengalis, or Bengalis themselves thought of themselves as an ethnicity, that may not be that antique. But at the very least, from the rule of Shashanka, and Shashanka ruled from Karna-Subarna, which is in today's Murshidabad, not from Gaur. Gaur is in Malda, Karna-Subarna is in Murshidabad, which is roughly the fag end of the 6th century or early 7th century. From then, we do find some kind of a crystallization of a regional consciousness. But since the language Bengali, or at least literary texts written in the language Bengali, do not have such antiquity, so we are not very sure if linguistically the area also identified itself as regional. It indeed did, because from Shashanka's time, we have a sense of Bengal being a kingdom. But whether Bengali as a language, and therefore derivatively Bengali as a people, have any such cultural memory from the 7th century is seriously doubtful. But from the Chorjapad onwards, which is late 11th century, we could also ascribe it to the 10th century perhaps, and then because then Bengali literature starts off, and by the 13th, 14th century, we have people composing verses, and there's a steady flow of verses in literary Bengali. So it is absolutely impossible for a people to have a rich literary storehouse of that sort without already having a fairly widespread linguistic and cultural identity. So therefore, from when did Bengalis start thinking of themselves as Bengalis must be connected to the Bengali language perhaps, and wherein, since spoken antecedents of that are difficult to unravel or to record or to currently pick up from somewhere, so we must go by written records, and whereby I would put it at maybe 11th, 12th century onwards. Certainly the Bengali people, by virtue of having a language, would have certainly considered of themselves as a fairly homogeneous, literate, linguistic community.
Thank you for an extremely meticulous response, Professor. Just to contextualize it in the way I perceive, even Britain did not have a consciousness of being Britain or being British till the 11th or the 12th century. It's only with Chaucer that most people recognize there to be a British literature, and maybe a few hundred years prior to Chaucer. So until then, Britain was practically Rome, or Romanish. But that is not to draw any parallel between Britain and Bengal in any sense of the word parallel. I want to move on, Professor, to a related question, or maybe I'll club a couple of questions, because you are being extremely detailed, and we are also looking at the time a bit. So I'll just club two questions. Number one, is there something called Bengali exceptionalism? And I don't mean this as a historicist question necessarily, but also in terms of how we are experiencing Bengal and its changing social vicissitudes, commercial and political realities in the last 100 years. So is there something called Bengali exceptionalism? That is also to ask you, whether we as Indians might want to look at Goa, Kashmir, Kerala, Andhra, Uttar Pradesh, and Bengal, each with different lenses, and Bengal with lenses of of that phrase, Bengali exceptionalism. And my related question is, you've already touched on this. What has been Bengal's relationship with religion and culture? You mentioned the Buddhists. You mentioned the Pal dynasty. You mentioned the Senas. The Senas, by the way, again, correct me if I'm wrong, Professor. Were they from Andhra? Were they from the
they're from southern India. It's
part of
difficult
India?
to pinpoint. Yeah.
Were they also the ones to introduce things like astrology and occult arts to Bengal? These are just questions, speculations. But yeah, quickly, my questions are as follows. What is Bengali exceptionalism? Does it have any bearing on how we understand Bengal today, its politics, its culture? And what's been Bengal's relationship with religion and culture?
Right. So I'm not a big fan of Bengali exceptionalism at all, because it's precisely these sorts of ideas which bog us down and make us probably either complacent or self-congratulatory, or make us think of ourselves as being better than others or whatever. But historically, Bengal may have had three moments of exceptionalism. The first I've already mentioned, where Bengal was thought of in the 3rd, 4th century BC or so by Greco-Roman scholars as being an exceptional territory which cannot be conquered, which is this obscure object of your desire, but it's so exceptional, unlike the rest of the Gangetic plain, rest of the Punjab and Gangetic plain, that we cannot ever go there. So there was an exceptionalism ascribed to Bengal in terms of its unconquerability. The second thing comes probably during more Brahmanical construction of Indianness in the northern part of India, that is. So wherein the exceptional construction of Bengal as this rather curious place of either mlechas or these flesh and meat eating characters who are not really to be touched with a barge pole, or the land of black magic and all these kala jadoo knowing women who would turn your men folk into sheep, etc. So Bengal had been ascribed a negative kind of exceptionalism as that land which exists as this mystical land, which however should not necessarily come in contact with for fear of perhaps contamination. And the third moment of exceptionalism comes with and this is purely coincidental, with the British setting up of the British conquering significant tracts of the Indian subcontinent, because otherwise, if this is just a footnote, if Siraj, that is, if we pronounce it in the more pan-Indian style, if Siraj had not attacked Calcutta in 1756, then the British would not have attacked, would have had they would have continued exactly like the French and the Portuguese and the Dutch would have happily continued. And as the English do in other parts of the world also, like in China, they were happy with having Hong Kong to them. So the whole idea of the English at all conquering inland India rather than having little enclaves on the coast as the other European powers did, that was contingent upon this particular accident. So Siraj conquered Calcutta, and Calcutta had to fight back. Otherwise, Calcutta would have been just another port town like Pondicherry, like parts of Goa, etc., etc. But that being said, the third exceptionalism comes only because the English chose to expand inward and ended up conquering the whole of the subcontinent, and somehow Calcutta became the capital and therefore the epicenter of print activities, the epicenter of certain kinds of enlightenment, leading to what is generally called the Bengal Renaissance, etc., etc. Projecting Bengalis as the comprador of the burgeoning British rule as the enlightened elite, who thereafter would therefore be thought of as exceptionally modern, etc., etc. So these three moments of exceptionalism apart, and we seem to have inherited these three exceptionalisms, which we have internalized to such an extent that we still today believe, even with Calcutta not being the capital for more than 100 years now, the British having left for 75 years now, we no more necessarily being that negatively exceptional, and certainly militarily we are not even to be thought, or even in terms of resources, to be thought of as exceptional. That we continue to think of ourselves as exceptional was a hangover of this modernity, this us being the forerunners of colonial modernity, and we presumed that certain things which may happen in the rest of the subcontinent, namely, to be more specific, religious fundamentalism, communalism, certain obscurantisms, we presume with this sheen of colonial modern exceptionalism that it would never touch us. We would always stand over this, and we would indeed be we'd indeed be great, and which illusion would have been probably shattered by a few electoral outcomes of late, and therefore the whole idea of exceptionalism is being questioned. But I honestly would never have been a fan of this exceptionalism, and the sooner we shed this idea of exceptionalism, this idea of inherited exceptionalism, we ought to be exceptional perhaps, but one has to work for it. One has to try and really become exceptionally good, rather than presume that since we are Bengalis, we are indeed exceptional, because aren't we the forerunners of the Renaissance and therefore the torchbearers of modernity, etc., etc. No obscurantism can ever touch us. This kind of a complacent, internalized exceptionalism is something that really wasn't ever actually there, nor should we give much value to it. And the second part of your question concerned religion. So Bengal has been an exceptionally religious space, and so we talked about Buddhists a little while back, but that will from the to go back to Chandraketugarh. So there are certain artifacts which we thought of as Buddhist, which have been found from dating from the 3rd, 4th century BC onwards in Chandraketugarh. But that being said, so Buddhists would have significantly spread over Bengal by the 7th century or so, as the viharas, be it Mastangarh, be it Paharpur, etc., suggest. However, we find that, and with the Senas, as you said, comes Brahminical Hinduism, including the Sena king bringing those Kanyakubja Brahmins, because Bengal, again, exceptionally perhaps, did not have Brahmins. And after the Palas who were Buddhists, the Senas thought that who do we do our Hindu rituals with, etc. And Islam comes in the 13th century, but the speed with which both Hinduism and Islam gain ground, in spite of they being very late entrants, the primarily animist or majorly Buddhist Bengal suddenly overnight becomes 40% Hindu and 60% Muslim around the 13th century. And this is a curious turnover. And since then, one would go on to suggest that the twain, in spite of eras of peaceful coexistence, have generally always thought of each other as being the other. And therefore, significantly, there would have been a slight undercurrent of two-nationness all through. And the bottom line being that religion has always been a very strong force in Bengal's construction of its own nationalisms and own Bengalinesses. They've always been tied to these religious identities, and a secular composite Bengaliness would be a very, very late and very recent invention.
I think that would stir up a hornet's nest if somebody really heard each expression very carefully of whatever you said, Professor. I'm of course extremely impressed and feeling there's lots there for me to digest personally. I agree with most of it. I might want to ask you maybe in a different podcast someday, what do we make of Kali, and why is the image of Kali and mother worship so specific to Bengal? Although I know there are exceptions, but maybe that would be for some other day. My current question to you is this, and this would be my last question today, Professor, is, and I know this goes beyond perhaps our purview of expertise, but surely, since you've said that, we can discuss almost everything that makes sense in a cultural studies course. This, I think, should be within the realm of our discussion. That is, what do we make of parliamentary democracy and especially the constitution? Now, I've been reading recently the Constituent Assembly debates, and of course, there's a lot of representation of something like Bande Mataram and Bengaliness, and Sanskritized Bengaliness and non-Sanskritized Bengaliness, and what you call Brahminical Bengaliness and non-Brahminical forms of Bengaliness. And I have seen that in the Constituent Assembly debates, there were actually shared strands of Assamese, Bengali, and Odia identities, and they were trying to form a solidarity, not necessarily against some kind of Hindi nationalism, but at least substantively to cast their autonomy. Simply, my question here is this. In terms of whatever you've defined of Bengali history, Bengal's self-determination, and Bengali exceptionalism, because you have acknowledged that, yes, there is a certain kind of Bengali exceptionalism. So given these, do you think parliamentary democracy as we have it, elections, state elections, then national elections, and the constitution and federalism, and so on, all this suits the current, is this good for the destiny of Bengal? And when I ask that, I also mean recent political debates about why a certain form of government or a certain kind of ideology is never ever going to be suitable for Bengal. The communists ruled Bengal for 40 years, and one thought that is the only perhaps suitable ideology for the state, or there were others who thought that this is the worst ideology that could be in the state. So on those lines, do you think the current form of parliamentary democracy and federalism, as we understand, goes hand in hand with Bengali heritage and history?
Right. So first of all, a short answer would be, and wherein I would just, as you already said, I am being perhaps a bit too lengthy with my responses, but I would indeed lengthen it a bit. So the short answer would be that democracy, parliamentary democracy, by definition, is the rule of the numerical majority. And there is a presumption when parliamentary democracy became the common de facto universal mode of governance, that in spite of it being the rule of the numerical majority, there would be a significant enlightened section within that numerical majority who would, however, not steamroll minorities into submission because parliamentary democracy allows it. Now, unfortunately, that presumption that while it is a rule of the numerical majority, there will be an enlightened minority to guide it in the right way, in ethical ways, that itself held on for some time. But clearly, it doesn't hold anymore as the devolution of power happens from those enlightened few who, in the name of the rule of the numerical majority, however, really held the reins with their own enlightened views, own ethical views. So once democracy devolves into what it really is, namely the rule of the numerical majority, it indeed becomes the rule of the numerical majority. And majoritarianism can never be endorsed as being the rightful ethical mode of governance. So if the numerical majority, core majority,
it's not the rule of law.
Right.
It's not the rule of law.
It's not the rule of law. So indeed, therefore, parliamentary democracy per se cannot be the right mode of governance for any terrain, let alone Bengal, which is already, as we have discussed, a mixture of numerous communities, a mixture of numerous races, etc., etc. Because without some kind of a modicum of being able to take into account the ethical requirements of the other communities, how can the rule of the numerical majority necessarily prove itself the best way of governance? But that being said, so that was the short answer. And let me just divert into a couple of things, because when I was talking about exceptionalism a little while back, what I meant to say was that Bengal has not been automatically exceptional. Let us not complacently internalize the fact that, well, we have had this exceptionalism and poor us, now we are reduced to just about anybody. The fact of the matter is that exceptionalism has been a constructed thing, and exceptionalism is not a real thing, but which does not mean that exceptionalism should not be a cherishable thing. Because while it need not be that Bengal is exceptional, the exceptionality that we must aspire for, that is why I said we should work towards exceptionality. So while Bengal is just another province in this subcontinent, this huge subcontinent, which is driven by majoritarian drives and which is driven by religious fanaticism, which is driven, and all around the subcontinent, we can look to our eastern neighbors, our western neighbors, and not just India, which indeed itself has also shown the same signs that our neighbors would have shown for decades now. So while that may be the reality, but we should aspire for exceptionalism, and which connects to the response that I gave a little while back. So indeed, parliamentary democracy is probably here to stay. It is indeed the rule of the numerical majority. It is indeed, therefore, necessarily not the best and most ethical way of governance. But within that, or at least in spite of that, we must try to sow in those ethical exceptionalisms where, in spite of it being the rule of the majority, somehow there is indeed an ethical concern for diversity, for plurality, for the minorities, etc., etc. So unless and until parliamentary democracy is well tempered with that ethical exceptionalism where, in spite of me being a majority, I will not necessarily work only for the majority, unless that happens, we do not perhaps have any chance of governance. And Bengal, fortunately, has had historical precedents of doing the same. Templates brought out. The first would be the Bengal Pact of 1923 by Chittaranjan Das. Unfortunately, Chittaranjan Das died just a couple of years later, and the Bengal Pact could have never been brought into fruition, where he, recognizing the numerical majority of the Muslims and yet the cultural capital and therefore the governmental position holdings of the Hindu minority, he talked about this pact where a certain percentage, a significant percentage, I've forgotten the exact figure, maybe 70% or so, government jobs should be reserved for Muslims, etc., etc. So the Bengal Pact did not ever take off. Similarly, just on the eve of partition, while the two proposals that were put to vote, and a lot of hullabaloo has been made about Shyama Prasad's role in the partition of Bengal being carried through. He had just one vote, really. He was an insignificant small fry who, but anyway, whatever, let's not get into that. But a third notion, a third resolution that was not put to vote was the one forwarded by Sharat Chandra Bose, Netaji's elder brother, and Shuraburdi, who talked about a unified independent Bengal, and which Nehru opposed because he feared balkanization, and which would have had what is called a confessionist form of government. A confessionist form of government is a very interesting form of government. Bosnia and Herzegovina follows it, and there are other places who have historically tried to follow it, where you rotate premiership amongst different communities. So in Bosnia and Herzegovina also you have 3 different communities who rotate the premiership of the nation, and the Shuraburdi-Sharad Bose Pact of the confessionist government of a unified sovereign Bengal, which was not put to vote. And what was put to vote was whether the whole of Bengal should go to Pakistan, or Bengal should be partitioned and West Bengal should be in India and East Bengal in Pakistan. Only these 2 resolutions were put to vote. But in short, both the Bengal Pact forwarded by Chittaranjan Das and the confessionist government formula forwarded by Shuraburdi and Sharad Bose, they thought of this kind of a playing with the apparently absurd perhaps, but playing with the numerical major base of democracy with an enlightened look towards somehow being able to also benefit the minorities, somehow being able to, and which reservation in lay people's terms might opt to do. But anyway, that was a roundabout way of answering your question. So yes, I do believe that parliamentary democracy cannot, in its very basics, be the real mode of governance for any territory, and less even so for Bengal. But then we are stuck with it, and we are indeed therefore doomed to be necessarily governed by the numerically major. What do? We need to precisely re-inculcate, you brought up the communists, re-inculcate within us those very things like secularism, like modernity, like enlightenedness, like care, ethical care for the other regardingness, which are not automatic, which are not there just out there in the so-called Bengali exceptionalism, but which need to be sown perhaps, worked towards perhaps, so that we can temper the brute numerically majority rule that parliamentary democracy indeed is with that kind of an ethical sheen that would make it indeed the rule of law towards the benefit of each and every one of us who would like to call themselves Bengalis and would identify themselves with this land, which in itself is so divided by the international border and more borders than one, and which perhaps that kind of an enlightened tempering of a worked out exceptionalism along with parliamentary democracy can perhaps work towards.
Well, thank you so much. That's extremely enlightening, Professor. Since you brought up Dr. Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Barrister Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who was also the Vice Chancellor of Calcutta University. I mean, recently there have been lots of identities given to him, good, bad, otherwise. I read his speeches in the assembly as well. And although the gentleman had not actually had a prison sentence like the others, of course, Nehru was in prison for 9 years or more. And one understands where all that is coming from. I think the exceptionalism that he and others were trying to chalk out for Bengal was exactly on the lines that you are suggesting today. They were not inheriting a kind of exceptionalism or celebrating it automatically, but were trying to cultivate, and as you've rightly pointed out, they were trying to cultivate exceptional values in a state that was a Muslim majority. We forget that Pakistan was a moth-eaten territory that Muhammad Ali Jinnah did not want. He wanted Calcutta as his capital. So Calcutta and Bengal were Muslim majority sites, and that is why the interests of the minorities were so close to the hearts of the constitutionalists back in the 1940s. So thank you so much for reminding us of this widely forgotten fact, Professor. And thank you for all your other very, very wonderful and very layered and extremely knowledgeable remarks. I very much look forward to having you back on my show, Professor, whenever your time and inclination permit. Ladies and gentlemen, alas, this is the end of our conversation today, but I hope to be back with you with a new and exciting conversation very, very shortly. Thank you for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe. And to Professor Saugata Bhaduri, thank you so much, Professor, once again.
Thank you. And it was a pleasure being on your show, albeit it couldn't be much of a show because my video camera didn't work. So it's more tell than show, but nevertheless.
Thank you so much, Professor, as witty and as deep as always. Dear audience, thank you for joining. Until next time.
Thanks.